Now this is going to be our 2006 bench trimming video, and we're going to try to outline for people of all skill levels some of the things you can do when you go to bench trim a plane. This is our brand new for 2006 Testarossa. We're going to use that as an example of how to go about trimming this type of plane, but we're also going to try to include in some of the information that might help people with different skill levels of planes, from ARFs hopefully down to the world-class planes that we all wish we were flying. So before we go any further, let me just explain exactly what bench trimming is. So the first point that I'd like to make, bench trimming. This is a very simple thing, and let's pretend you have the most basic of planes, an ARF, an ARC, a profile. You want to bench trim the model before you fly it. When do you want to do it? Before you fly it. Now, a lot of the things that I try to get across in my videos are very simple, basic things, but a lot of times when you think them through, a lot of times what you're not realizing is this is a very simple point that's easy to miss. A lot of people, for instance, would take that new plane, new profile, new whatever they've just built, and they go out, take it right off the bench, and go fly it. Well, here's what I'm suggesting as a better way. Before the first flight, like to do something that I call bench trimming. That's what most people call trimming out a model before you actually fly it. And how we go about doing it and how we do it to various classes of planes, that's going to be the subject of this tape. Now, why would you do it? The simple question, and a lot of people might be prone to ask, well, gee whiz, I just finished up my flight streak profile or my this, or a very simple plane, an ARF and ARC. Why do I need to do it? Isn't it all done when you buy the model? Well, some of it is and some of it isn't. But I want to cover the why. Why? Because the various models, because of the way they're constructed and the material they used, whether they're ARFs, ARCs, or the world-class world champion plane, they all deal with a thing called the center of gravity. And that center of gravity varies even in planes that are built by the same person at the same time with the same wood. That CG can vary. So what you want to do is, part of this is going to be to identify where the CG is and then trim accordingly. We want to trim nose heavy planes, tail heavy planes, ships that have an incorrect or a hard to deal with CG. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to be called the center of gravity. So the first thing to really evaluate for yourself is when you want to do this, you'd really like to do it to maximize the potential gain before you ever fly the model. And that's why we call it bench trimming. And why would you want to do it? Because these CG locations can vary from model to model, among other things, including wing warps, things we're going to deal with in detail. But these are the basics. This is like 101 basic bench trimming. So what would be some of the benefits of doing this? You're going to spend a couple hours, maybe more, maybe less, but some amount of time. Well, what we're trying to achieve is to, and part of it is going to be, again, referring to the center of gravity, the place where the model balances. What some of the benefits would be is the plane would fly safer, less prone to crash. It'd be easier. A model that's properly balanced, properly trimmed, and checked for warps is going to be safer to fly, easier to fly, if nothing else, and better, among other things. So the point here is that by and hopefully you'll get some of this information from this DVD, maybe some that you'll add to the information that we're exchanging, but that will go through a process, and at the end of it, you'll be better off than you were at the beginning of it. Now, how to go about doing it, and this is a method that I've developed over about 52 years of flying these types of control line airplanes. I've tried to put all the information that I've learned onto all of my videos and DVDs, but how to go about bench trimming it, how to go about getting the most value in a bench trimming so that you absolutely stack the deck in your favor for that first flight. And what we're going to be dealing with is many various aspects and steps of how to bench trim. Now, a lot of these, and what I'm trying to do, and I'm not sure how successful I'm going to be at doing it, is I've made up a little script of what I think are, it's going to start off with very simple basic things, and it's going to end up with things that may or may not even be appropriate for people that are not trimming out world-class stunt ships. But we're going to try to cover the whole range of possibilities. And we're going to try to do it in a way that makes sense, because the example that I always use is a person that's really, really good at what they do, at teaching, can make a very complex subject seem simple and easy. And that's what we try to do with all our videos, all our tapes. We'll also try to make it fun, of course, but we want to start with a couple of basic things that'll help you understand what goes into a bench trimming of a model. So the first thing that I'd like to explain, and we're going to use this as a Brodak Cardinal profile as an example. The first most basic thing anybody would want to know, you're going to have a wide variety of engines that are going to go in a model. In fact, let's use an example. A Nobler was designed around a Fox 35. A big Cardinal was designed around a Super Tiger 60. Well, based on how much this motor weighs, we're going to turn the plane into very similar to a seesaw. Now let's just pretend the model is a seesaw, and this is an oversimplification. And on one end of the seesaw, we have all the things that go in front of the center of gravity. This, of course, is the center of gravity. And on this side, all the things that go ahead of the CG, behind the CG. What you notice right away is a lot of the heavier components, the motor, the fuel tank, the wheels, the landing gear, sometimes or most times the spinner, the prop. A lot of these things are ahead of the CG. However, they're closer to the CG. A lot of the things that are behind the CG are a little bit lighter. Tail is typically lighter. The tail wheel is typically lighter. This amount of the body is typically lighter than the part with the motor mounts, but the problem is it's on a longer moment arm. And what the moment arm means is this part of the seesaw is longer. So here's what we're really dealing with. Is a seesaw where the back of the seesaw is a lot longer than the front. The front is heavier, the back is longer. And understanding that gives you a real basic idea of what you're dealing with. But you need to know where that center of gravity is before you can really make any progress or even start to trim a model. The single most important thing to know when you finish a model and it's painted or monocoated, buffed, or if you just buy an ARF, is where does it balance? This is 101 basic, where does it balance? Now, for all practical purposes, and to be very simplistic about it, the simplest way to determine if a model balances is just put it on 2 rolls of paper towels, and I would sketch these in, and it should, somewhere near the high point of the wing, it should balance. In other words, when we lay a roll of paper towels out and lay the model out, if the nose tends to drop, it's nose heavy. If the tail tends to drop, it's tail heavy. So we want to know, first, before we do anything, we now have this new model. Is it nose heavy or is it tail heavy? And this is a basic way of doing it, right at the root of the wing, right outside of where the fuselage is. If the tail drops, that's the worst scenario possible. A tail-heavy plane is very difficult to fly. It's unstable. So that if we have a choice of, if it's not balanced right where the designer calls for, if you look at a Nobler and you see where George Aldrich picked the center of gravity that he felt was optimum, well, if you're wrong and it's nose heavy, if when you lay it on the high point of the wing, the nose tends to fall down, it's a lot better than, in fact, let's just sketch this out. This we can live with. This is going to get risky. So if it's not balanced in just about the way we'd like, or if we're wrong, nose heavy is going to be better than tail heavy. And it's going to be better by a lot, and for a lot of reasons. And as we'll see, as we go through more of the detailed parts of this, this is only one center of gravity, but it's the most important one for the beginners or the new people or the people coming back to the sport after many years away. First thing, before we go anyplace else, we've never flown the model, we don't even have handle and lines, we want to put the motor in, want to put the prop on, the fuel tank in, the wheels on, every part. And then we want to see where does it balance. Now if we find out it's a little tail heavy, or if that tail tends to sink down, the choices are very easy. We can put a heavier spinner, a nose weight, a heavier muffler on the motor, all of the above, a heavier prop. A carbon fiber or nylon prop instead of wood, or a heavier motor. But for sure, unless I was an expert flyer, I'd want to start with the model being nose heavy, and then little by little take some of this weight out until and as you take the nose weight out, the model is going to get more and more unstable. Unstable being that in level flight, it's going to want to change direction quickly, and of course, during maneuvers, it's going to loop tighter and turn tighter in corners. But every part of that trim is a trade-off. As the plane gets more and more unstable, it gets harder and harder and harder to fly. So we want to reach a compromise where your skill level would determine this. Now, if you were, for instance, a rank beginner, or you're trying to teach your grandson to fly, you'd want this CG forward. Where it balances, even then add a little bit of nose weight. As you get to be more and more proficient, more highly skilled, you can move this center of gravity back up to a point. And there are reasonable and unreasonable amounts you can move this. But usually what you'll find is on most models there's a range. And I'll detail that out in terms of degrees later on, but there's always a range each model has where at this forward point a rank beginner would be comfortable. At this rear point, people that are very highly skilled would be comfortable. Now what also tends to complicate this is as models get a light model, if you build a kit and all the wood is very good and you tend to finish very light, do a lot of sanding, a light model tends to balance nose heavy, which is good. If you build heavy and the total weight of the model, and of course this is all a subjective thing, let's use a Nobler for an example, and you build it at 50 ounces, the odds are real good it's going to be tail heavy. The reason is more and more of the model is behind the center of gravity. So as you add material, paint, glue, that end of the model tends to get a lot heavier quickly than the nose part. So there's always the tendency. A light model will tend to always be nose heavy. A heavy model will always tend to be tail heavy. And that's just a general assumption. Now we also have an issue of, and this is less critical, but still something you would want to know, is we want to divide the model up, the center of gravity. We call this the vertical CG. Now before you even fly a model, it'd be nice to know if the top or heavier than the bottom. And the way to check that is normally with your two fingers, put one finger in front of the wing, right on the center line, one finger behind the flap. This is the basic for profiles and very simple way to do it. There's a lot of complicated ways with plumb bobs, but this is a simple way with the outer tip down and see which way the model falls. So that when that model is sitting straight up and down, and it's going to be sitting like this with its wheels. Now, of course, it's the other way around, so what we want to do, assuming you don't fly backwards, you fly the traditional way. So while the model's like this, if it tends to fall with the wheels go up, you can add heavier wheels. You can make the landing gear longer. If it falls the other way, if the wheel side tends to fall down, it's a low CG. And what that means is the model's probably going to need a trim tab or some trim to keep the wing level. And let me explain why that is. This is getting to the area where it gets a little complicated, but certainly not out of the realm of any accomplished modeler to figure out. Again, we're looking at the model head on, and what happens if this is out of balance, and let's just really emphasize what a lot of bad things happen when this is wrong. They're not as bad as when it's out of balance the other way, but still bad. So what tends to happen here, if the wheels are too heavy, and let's pretend you have these old-fashioned Vico wheels that weigh about 1.5 ounces each, and you want them on because it's a nostalgic look you're looking for. As centrifugal force is acting on the model, it's not pushing on the top and the bottom equally. So what happens is these wheels tend to make the model do this. The force down at the wheels are tilting it up. If it's the other way around and the red side of the model is heavier, it'll tend to fly like that. Now, the truth is, you can make up for this in a lot of ways. You can correct the imbalance by making heavier, lighter, longer, shorter wheel pants, or reorient the hardware on the model until it balances perfectly. But if it's wrong, and let's just pretend you want to have those wheels. It's important that you have those wheels on your old-time stunt model. It's going to want to fly up just a little bit. We'll assume that the wing is straight. A little trim tab will counteract that. And that's going to put a down force that's going to, in turn, push that back down. So what we're trying to do is balance off a lot of the different forces that act on a model. And this is one of the ones that we can do right in the shop. Leveling the wing and making sure the wing is level, we almost have to fly the model unless it's so out of whack that you can see it from across the room. But the CG balance related things we can do on the bench, and that's the point of this video. Now the next thing to understand is the lead out rake. Rake is, if we were to take, and we know the CG is here, and we're just going to make a number up. We know that it's 6 inches from here to the center of gravity. We want to know the average point of the lead outs. Not where either one of them come out. We want to know the average. So what would happen if our bell crank is in here? Let's put a straightforward bell crank in there. And we know this is 6 inches to the pivot point of the bell crank. Where do the lead outs come out on a typical model? Well, on almost all models, they'll be raked from 1 inch to 1.5 inches. That means where these, a rake being that they don't run parallel to the hinge line, they rake back. That rake is identified, and I would say a good starting point is 1 inch to 1.5 inches of rake. Right on the bench, model doesn't have to be flown. This is bench trimming. We have a whole video on how to do air trimming once the plane is flying, but this is to get it safe. Now, that would mean this dimension, and it's the average point. It isn't the front lead out, and it isn't the back lead out. It's the midpoint, the average point that counts. So it's the average. We measure the average back, and let's say in the case it's 6 inches to the bell crank bolt. this would be 5. That would then give us 1 inch of rake. 1 inch of rake is a good place to start trimming most models. Now another thing, while we're checking dimensions, and it assumes you have that either the designer put the lead outs at the correct place, a la Nobler, or you have adjustable lead outs. Also, another thing while we're checking would be hinge line to hinge line. We pick up 4 points here. We would like to know that from hinge line to hinge line, these are equal. Now, if they're not, it means the model is going to have trim issues later on. Well, you might want to address that right now or when you're building a model. This is a very important thing, is to have hinge line to hinge line equal. Equal hinge lines, 1 inch to 1.5 inches of rake, and some very slight rudder offset, very slight motor offset, maybe a degree or 2. All of these things combine to make the model stable and hold line tension the way it's supposed to, the way it's designed to. Now, we can go to a worst of all worlds scenario, which is what I always do. I always try to explain to people what's the worst can happen. If this lines are raked in the opposite direction, positive rake would mean you are really going to have a handful of a plane to fly, because as you move the lead outs forward, the plane gets touchy. As you move the lead outs back, it becomes stable. And this is why we have to pick that mean average point, because we want to have hopefully the best of all worlds. We don't want to have a plane that's real touchy, almost impossible to fly. The other thing, if you're going to have a rudder, it's straight or a little bit offset, but never in at you. You don't want the rudder in at you, for sure. If you have motor offset, if it's 0, well, that probably would be okay. A little offset on a profile especially is okay, but you never want to have it pointing in at you. This is the no-no part of it. Now, the way you would measure this, real easy. Put a prop on a plane and measure from this prop blade parallel to the fuselage. And a good place to start is when the outer part is 1/8 of an inch less. From a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch less. The longer of the two dimensions, you can measure right to the middle of the prop blade. If you really want to be scientific, you can take an old prop with one blade, and I'm going to just illustrate this. This is the high-tech way to do it, and CA on a pin or a piece of wire. Then flip it. So that ensures that you don't have crooked blades. That wire now would allow you to measure this a little more accurately. But the choice of having 0, not sure. I always like to have a little bit of offset, a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch. And if I'm just starting out and the person I'm trying to help is not highly skilled, 1/8 of an inch is better than a 1/16, and a 1/16 is better than 0. If we're dealing with new people, a little extra rake doesn't hurt, 1.5 inches, but negative rake could be a real problem. So these are things that you want to check before this model ever gets fuel in it. All of these things are checkable, doable, and you can do them very methodically. Now the next item assumes right in the beginning that you have an adjustable tip weight box. Most modern planes designs do. If you don't, clay. Children's clay, good thing to have in your toolbox. Heat it in your hands, roll it up in a ball, and slap it right on the front of the wing. In other words, if the airfoil is here, let it go around the front of the airfoil. Now, how much do you put on there? Well, if you don't have, let's pretend you don't have any way of knowing where this model balances. Well, we know that part of what we're trying to do is work all the things into balance. Well, in a perfect world, here's what you would have. You would be able to balance the model either upside down or right side up by holding the prop and maybe putting something under the tail wheel and putting a scale under this wingtip, a gram scale. And on a typical model, I would say this, on a 40 size model, 1.5 ounces. On a 60 size ship, 2 ounces to start with. Probably would take some of that out, but that's a good starting point. And that would mean that as you put that model up on a scale, and you would balance it somehow where it's here, where it's free to seesaw, you would like to have the scale read 1.5 ounces to 2 ounces. The other choice you would have, and the reason you do that is because you can't account for how heavy this wingtip is. Is this one hollowed more than this one? This accounts for all that. So it's a little better to do it with a scale. Now, does that mean that's the only way to do it? No, of course not. But this is the better of the two ways. The other way is you get chunks of lead or clay and just take that amount and put it in the tip weight box or put it in clay on the outside of the wing. Again, here's the scenarios. If you're wrong and you have a little bit too much, nothing bad's going to happen. Plane will probably drag a wingtip and have a lot of line tension. Then you take it out little by little by little by little until you're happy with the line tension and how the model's flying. But for the first flight, a bench trim, I would always want to have a little more than a little less. A little more is never going to hurt you, other than the fact the plane will have a little more than normal tension. A little bit not enough is risking the model. Now, these are some of the other things that if you have choices, these are some of the other desirable things that you can already have. A motor that's already broken in. A motor that's been in a plane, you know pretty much how it runs. It's a proven commodity. It's an old friend. It's always better on a new plane that you're bench trimming to not have to deal with a brand new unbroken in motor. So having a motor that's an old friend can really help. Same thing. And let's make an example up. If last year you were flying a twister and this year you build a new twister. Well, what would really make sense is to take the motor out of last year's plane that has all the flights on it and put it in the new ship. Because you know that motor, you know how it runs, you know what prop goes on it, you know all the little idiosyncrasies that are going to go into it. Well, having a motor, a fuel tank, and a prop, let's be real clear about this, because a lot of people cheat themselves in a way. And that's the fuel tank, there's the motor, good artwork. Prop, motor, tank. If these are from the previous model you've had, or if you have a 60 stunt ship and you took last year's prop, motor, and tank, which I've done in the past, I've taken it right out of Miss Ashley, put it right in another plane. Well, now these are proven commodities. You don't have to worry where the tank shim is going to go, what glow plug is going to work the best. The more homework you can do ahead of time, the easier you make it on yourself. So having proven things is always to your advantage. Now, up to this point, these are all things we need to check in the shop. Prop clearance is one. You'd be surprised how many people have a model. The model sits down like this in a little bit of an angle, and they put a prop on, and it has clearance when the tail of the model is down, but as soon as it gets up for takeoff, you don't have enough clearance. What should happen, and what you should do, and this is really where a lot of people have accidents for sure, is measure with the model these two dimensions, center line to center line, that they're equal. In other words, put something to raise the tail of the model up so that it's sitting perfectly level to the table. Put the prop on that you intend to use, and I would say a minimum would be a 1/2 inch of prop clearance. Many people, many, even in our club, on the first flight, they let go of that model and they raised it